The night air over Mulberry Street was cold and still. December 11th, 1990. Inside the Ravenite Social Club, the lights burned low. Outside, in an unmarked vehicle parked 2 blocks north, FBI Special Agent George Gabriel sat with headphones pressed to his ears. What he heard that night would end an empire. John Gotti was talking, and this time, every word was being recorded. For nearly a decade, the man they called the Teflon Don had beaten every case the federal government threw at him. 3 trials. 3 acquittals. Juries had been intimidated. Witnesses had recanted. Defense lawyers had torn apart government witnesses on the stand while Gotti walked out of courtrooms waving to cameras in hand-stitched suits. The FBI had watched, rebuilt, and tried again. 3 times they had failed. Tonight was different. Tonight, the microphone was in the right place at the right time, and Gotti did not know it was there. The question was not whether they finally had him. The question was whether any of it would hold. This is the story of how the FBI dismantled the most powerful organized crime family in American history. It is the story of a surveillance operation that took years to get right. It is the story of a betrayal that sealed a conviction no jury could walk away from. And it is the story of a man whose certainty that he was untouchable turned out to be the thing that finished him. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born on October 27, 1940, in the South Bronx. He was one of 13 children raised in poverty, and by the time his family moved to Brooklyn's East New York neighborhood in the 1950s, he had already found his way into street crime. He dropped out of school at 16. By his early 20s, he was working under Carmine Fatico, a capo in the Gambino crime family, running hijacking operations out of Kennedy Airport. He was arrested for hijacking in 1968 and again in 1969. He served time. It did nothing to slow him down. What distinguished Gotti from 100 other street-level criminals in New York was his ambition and his instinct for theater. He was physically imposing, articulate, and almost magnetically charismatic. He cultivated an image, the expensive suits, the perfect hair, the open disdain for law enforcement that played well in his neighborhood in Howard Beach, Queens. He organized block parties for local children. He was visible in ways that most mafia figures deliberately avoided. Where other bosses sought obscurity, Gotti sought the spotlight. It was a calculated gamble, and for years, it worked. By the early 1980s, Gotti had risen to the rank of capo under Gambino family boss Paul Castellano. The relationship was tense. Castellano was a different kind of boss, corporate, cautious, more interested in legitimate business fronts than street operations. Gotti, ambitious and increasingly impatient, had built a loyal crew around him. He had powerful allies, including underboss Agnello Della Croce, whose death from cancer on December 2, 1985, removed the last restraining force between Gotti and what he had already decided to do. 11 days later, on December 16, 1985, at approximately 5:26 p.m., 3 gunmen emerged from the crowd outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan. Paul Castellano and his driver, Thomas Bellotti, stepped out of a black Lincoln Town car. They were shot dead on the sidewalk. At least 6 members of Gotti's crew participated in the ambush, wearing identical hats and trench coats to create confusion among witnesses. Gotti himself watched from a passing car, alongside his close associate, Joseph Armoni. The hit had been organized in violation of commission rules, which required approval before the elimination of a sitting boss. Gotti had not sought that approval. He did not believe he needed it. Within days, John Gotti was effectively running the Gambino family. By the following year, he was recognized as boss. He held court at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, and later at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Manhattan's Little Italy. He gave interviews. He allowed cameras. He became, to much of the tabloid press, a figure of dark glamour. The New York Post ran his photo on the front page so often that he was practically a celebrity. The FBI was not entertained. The Gambino Squad, officially designated as FBI Organized Crime Unit C-16, had been tracking Gotti since well before the Castellano hit. The unit was led by Supervisory Special Agent Bruce Mao, a methodical and deeply experienced organized crime investigator who had spent years building a picture of Gambino family operations. Mao understood that to convict Gotti, the FBI would need more than surveillance photographs and informant testimony. Prior prosecutions had shown exactly how vulnerable those evidence types were to jury manipulation and witness intimidation. The team needed Gotti's own voice. They needed him on tape, speaking about crimes he had committed or ordered, in terms specific enough to survive cross-examination. The first attempt at electronic surveillance targeted the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. The FBI planted a listening device in the club and captured Gotti, speaking freely about family business. Those recordings contributed to an initial indictment in 1984 on charges of assault and conspiracy. But the case collapsed. Gotti's defense team was aggressive, and questions about the recording's legality gave the jury room to doubt. Gotti walked. The second prosecution, in 1986, targeted Gotti on racketeering charges stemming from an assault on a refrigeration workers' union official. The government believed the case was solid. The jury acquitted on all counts. Later, FBI and federal investigators developed credible evidence that Gotti's associate George Papey had bribed a juror number 11, a man named George Papey, to hold out for acquittal. Papey was eventually convicted of obstruction of justice, but the damage was done. Gotti had beaten the case. The third prosecution came in 1990 in New York State Court, charging Gotti with ordering the shooting of Carpenters Union official John O'Connor, who had allegedly ordered the trashing of a Gambino-connected restaurant. The star witness, Ecuadorian carpenter Matty Traynor, recanted. Another witness vanished. The jury acquitted again. The Teflon Don label entered permanent use. Newspapers ran the phrase on front pages across the country. To many observers, it seemed that John Gotti was genuinely beyond the reach of American law. I spent hours going through the case files and court records from those 3 failed prosecutions, and one detail kept surfacing. In each case, the government's evidence was real. The problem was delivery. Witnesses could be threatened. Juries could be reached. Documents could be explained away by skilled defense attorneys. But there is one category of evidence that a defense lawyer cannot explain, cannot reframe, and cannot undermine. A man's own voice, recorded on tape, describing his crimes in his own words, with no ambiguity about meaning. That was what Bruce Mao needed. And in 1988, the FBI began the operation that would finally produce it. The Ravenite Social Club at 247 Mulberry Street was the acknowledged center of Gambino family operations in Manhattan. Gotti was there regularly, meeting with capos, receiving tribute, conducting business. The FBI had been monitoring the club's exterior since the mid-1980s, documenting who came and went, photographing meetings, building an organizational chart of the family structure. But the interior of the club was another matter. Getting a listening device inside posed extraordinary risks. The club was checked regularly for electronic surveillance equipment. Gotti's inner circle was deeply suspicious of any unfamiliar faces. The physical layout, a narrow storefront on a block full of residents who knew each other, made covert access extremely difficult. The FBI's technical team identified a partial solution in 1989. Surveillance footage and building records showed that the second floor of 247 Mulberry Street contained a residential apartment. If a listening device could be placed in that apartment, it might capture conversations taking place in the club below or in the building's hallway, where Gotti and his associates sometimes conducted sensitive discussions, apparently believing that moving away from the main room provided protection from surveillance. The challenge was access. The apartment was occupied. Obtaining a warrant to install surveillance equipment required demonstrating probable cause, establishing the technical feasibility of the operation, and doing so without alerting Gotti's associates to the investigation's direction. The FBI worked through the legal requirements carefully, building a warrant application supported by years of accumulated surveillance records. The warrant was approved. The technical team made entry on multiple occasions, each time under conditions that required extraordinary operational security. A single mistake, a neighbor who noticed something unusual, a member of Gotti's security detail who checked the building more carefully than expected, would have blown the entire operation and potentially endangered agents. The devices worked. Beginning in late 1989 and continuing into 1990, FBI agents monitoring the Ravenite picked up conversations of significant evidentiary value. But the most critical recordings came from a third location the FBI had not initially anticipated. The breakthrough came from an apartment one floor above the Ravenite Club itself. The FBI identified that Gotti and a small group of his most trusted associates, including underboss Frank Locascio, occasionally moved upstairs to a specific apartment to conduct their most sensitive conversations. The apartment belonged to the widow of a deceased Gambino associate. Gotti apparently believed that moving to this location provided a layer of insulation against surveillance. He was wrong. The FBI obtained authorization to install a listening device in that apartment as well. The recordings that device produced were unlike anything the Gambino squad had captured before. What the microphones captured between November and December 1990 was extraordinary. Gotti discussed specific murders. He discussed the internal politics of the commission, the umbrella organization that theoretically governed the 5 families of New York. He discussed corruption of labor unions, including the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and various construction industry unions. He discussed payments to judges and officials. He criticized specific members of his own family in terms that left no doubt about the nature of the organization's operations. In one recording from November 30th, 1990, Gotti made statements directly implicating himself in the murder of Robert DiBernardo, a Gambino family member Gotti had ordered eliminated in 1986. In another, he discussed the Castellano hit in terms that, while not a direct confession, placed him unambiguously at the center of the decision. And there was something else. Gotti's contempt for his own associates, recorded in his own voice, gave prosecutors something no prior case had delivered. The internal hierarchy of the family, described by the boss himself, with Gotti at the top, giving orders and receiving tribute. What's most surprising about these recordings is not that Gotti was incriminating himself. He had always been reckless about operational security in ways that more cautious bosses were not. What's most surprising is that he apparently never stopped to consider that a building he used regularly for sensitive meetings had not been thoroughly swept by his own people. For a man who had beaten 3 federal prosecutions, the carelessness was stunning. In the end, it was not the FBI's persistence alone that brought him down. It was John Gotti's own certainty that he was untouchable. By December 11, 1990, agents had assembled hundreds of hours of recordings. The legal team, led by Assistant United States Attorney Andrew Maloney and overseen by the Eastern District of New York, had begun mapping the recordings against known criminal acts and building a racketeering indictment under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, commonly known as RICO. The statute, enacted in 1970 specifically to address organized crime networks, allowed prosecutors to charge Gotti not merely for individual crimes, but for his role in the ongoing criminal enterprise of the Gambino family itself. On December 11, 1990, John Gotti, Frank Locascio, and several associates were arrested. Gotti was taken into custody without incident. He arrived at the federal courthouse in Brooklyn dressed immaculately, as always. He showed no outward sign of concern. His lawyers, led by Albert Krieger, immediately began preparing a defense. The early signal from the Gotti camp was defiance. The recordings would be challenged on authenticity and context, and the government's witnesses, whoever they might be, would be destroyed on cross-examination. What the defense team did not know, and what would not become public for several more weeks, was that the government had a far more devastating weapon than any recording. Salvatore Gravano was born on March 12, 1945, in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. He had been involved with the Gambino family since his 20s, rising steadily through the organization on the strength of his willingness to do the things that needed doing. By the time Gotti became boss, Gravano was a capo. After the Castellano hit, in which he had played a significant organizational role, Gravano's position in the family grew more prominent. Gotti trusted him and eventually elevated him to underboss, making him the second highest-ranking member of the Gambino organization. Gravano was also, by his own eventual accounting, responsible for 19 murders. When he was arrested alongside Gotti in December 1990, Gravano's legal situation was existentially dire. The charges against him, if proven, carried the possibility of life imprisonment without parole. He had a wife, children, and assets that the government was prepared to forfeit. He had watched the government's evidence against Gotti being assembled over the preceding months. And as someone deeply familiar with the family's operations, he had an accurate sense of how damaging the Ravenite recordings actually were. Gravano's attorneys opened preliminary discussions with prosecutors in the fall of 1991. The negotiations were delicate and conducted in strict secrecy. From the government's perspective, Gravano's testimony would transform an already strong case into something airtight. He could speak to the internal operations of the family from direct personal knowledge that no outside investigator could match. He had been present at meetings. He had received orders directly from Gotti. He knew things that were not on any recording. From Gravano's perspective, cooperation offered the only realistic path to something less than dying in federal prison. The FBI had one overriding concern. If word reached Gotti that Gravano was talking, the reprisals would be immediate and potentially fatal. Gravano would need to be separated from the general population and protected under conditions that could be maintained without anyone in the Gambino organization learning what was happening. The logistics of keeping a potential cooperating witness secure while simultaneously managing the existing prosecution were significant. The FBI's Witness Security Division coordinated with the prosecution team to establish the necessary protocols. Put yourself in Gravano's position for a moment. He had spent his entire adult life inside the Gambino family. He had taken lives on the family's behalf. He had built his identity entirely around loyalty to an organization that rewarded that loyalty with wealth, status, and protection. Cooperating meant not just legal risk if discovered, but the near-certain knowledge that everyone he had known for decades would regard him as the worst possible thing a member of the life could be. It meant living under a new identity, in a new location, for the rest of his life. And it meant testifying in open court against John Gotti, a man with the resources and the motivation to make that testimony as dangerous as possible. Gravano agreed anyway. On November 8, 1991, the Eastern District of New York officially announced that Salvatore Gravano had entered into a cooperation agreement with the federal government. Here is the take that will probably draw some argument. In the years since the Gotti conviction, Sammy Gravano has become a controversial figure for reasons entirely separate from the Gotti case. He violated his cooperation agreement spectacularly, running an ecstasy distribution ring in Arizona after entering witness protection. He was convicted again in 2002 and served additional prison time. Some observers have argued that the government gave him far too lenient a deal given the scope of his admitted crimes. That criticism is legitimate, but without Gravano's testimony, the question of whether the Ravenite recordings alone would have been sufficient to guarantee conviction remains genuinely open. Prosecutors believed they had a strong case on the recordings. Defense attorneys believed they had room to work. Gravano closed that room permanently. The deal was the price of certainty, and the government decided certainty was worth it. The defense team's response to the Gravano announcement was exactly what anyone familiar with Gotti's prior prosecutions would have expected. Albert Krieger immediately moved to sever Gravano's case from Gotti's, arguing that Gravano's cooperation poisoned the entire prosecution. The motion was denied. Krieger then attacked Gravano's credibility, characterizing him as a mass murderer, seeking to save his own life by destroying the man who had trusted him most. It was a coherent argument. Juries had heard similar arguments before and acquitted. The difference this time was that Gravano's testimony would not stand alone. The defense team mounted a technical challenge to the Ravenite recordings themselves. They hired acoustic experts to argue that portions of the recordings were inaudible, ambiguous, or susceptible to multiple interpretations. They challenged the chain of custody for the recording equipment and argued that the installation of the listening devices had not fully complied with the legal requirements of the warrant. The challenge required the prosecution to produce detailed documentation of every step in the surveillance operation, from the initial warrant application through the installation of each device to the cataloging of every recorded conversation. Assembling that documentation required weeks of additional work by the FBI technical team and the prosecution staff. Several recordings were ultimately ruled partially inadmissible on specific technical grounds. But the core of the evidentiary record survived every challenge intact. The most damaging recordings, including Gotti's statements about the Di Bernardo murder and his comments about the family's criminal operations, were ruled admissible by Judge I. Leo Glasser, who presided over the trial in the Eastern District of New York. The trial began on January 21, 1992, in Brooklyn Federal Court. Gotti arrived each day impeccably dressed in what reporters described as suits costing several $1,000s each. He maintained a composed, almost dismissive demeanor throughout the proceedings. His attorneys cross-examined each government witness aggressively. When Gravano took the stand, the cross-examination lasted for days. Krieger attempted to portray him as a calculating liar who had fabricated details to minimize his own role in the family's crimes. Gravano remained composed. He had been thoroughly prepared by the prosecution team. His testimony was specific, detailed, and internally consistent. On the Castellano murder, he described his own role and Gotti's in direct terms. On other murders, he provided dates, locations, and the names of the men who carried them out. And then there were the tapes. Prosecutors played the Ravenite recordings for the jury in sequence, pairing them with Gravano's explanations of what specific references meant. A phrase that might seem ambiguous in isolation became unambiguous when Gravano explained its context from personal knowledge. The combination of the recorded voice and the live witness who could decode it was, from an evidentiary standpoint, as close to perfect as federal organized crime prosecution had ever achieved. The defense could do nothing about either element. They could attack Gravano's character, and they did. They could attack the recording process, and they did. But they could not explain away what jurors heard with their own ears. John Gotti, in his own voice, discussing murder. John Gotti, in his own voice, exercising the authority of the boss of the most powerful mafia family in the United States. John Gotti, in his own voice, describing an organization that existed for no purpose other than criminal enterprise. The jury received the case on March 31, 1992. They deliberated for 13 hours. On April 2, 1992, at 2:15 in the afternoon, the jury returned to the courtroom. John Gotti sat at the defense table in a dark suit, expressionless. The clerk read the verdict. Count 1, racketeering, guilty. Count 2, murder conspiracy in the death of Paul Castellano, guilty. The reading continued through all 13 counts. Guilty on everyone. The courtroom, packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and members of the public, was entirely silent as each verdict was announced. Gotti showed no visible reaction. His lawyers sat motionless. Outside the courthouse, a crowd that had gathered in support of Gotti received the news in silence and then dispersed. The Teflon Don era was over. On June 23, 1992, Judge I. Leo Glasser sentenced John Gotti to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Gotti was transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, which at the time housed the federal system's highest security population. He was later moved to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, as his health declined. There is a line in the sentencing transcript that reads, almost like fiction. Judge Glasser, before pronouncing sentence, looked at Gotti and described what the evidence had shown. A man who had made himself the chief executive of a criminal organization that corrupted, extorted, and murdered with impunity for years, and who had done so while cultivating a public persona designed to insulate him from exactly the accountability he was now facing. The judge noted that the sentence was mandatory under the statute. There was no discretion to exercise. The law that Gotti had spent years outsmarting had caught him at last, and it held no exceptions. Frank Locascio, convicted alongside Gotti on racketeering and murder conspiracy charges, also received a life sentence. He was released in 2018 after serving more than 2 decades, citing compassionate release due to his age and health. Salvatore Gravano received a sentence of 5 years for his role in the murders he admitted to under the cooperation agreement, a term that reflected the extraordinary scope and value of his cooperation. He was released and entered witness protection. The Gambino prosecution sent immediate reverberations through organized crime in New York and nationally. The convictions showed that RICO, combined with electronic surveillance and high-level cooperation agreements, had created a prosecutorial framework against which traditional mafia defenses had no reliable answer. The 5 families of New York had spent decades cultivating jury intimidation, witness tampering, and political protection as their primary defensive tools. Those tools had worked against conventional prosecutions. They did not work against an indictment built on an organization's own recorded conversations and the testimony of its number two man. In the years following Gotti's conviction, federal prosecutors used the same framework against the Lucchese family, the Colombo family, and other organized crime organizations across the country. The combination of RICO charges, electronic surveillance authorized under Title III of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, and cooperating witnesses became the standard model for complex criminal enterprise prosecutions. The Gotti case was not merely a conviction. It was a proof of concept that reshaped federal organized crime enforcement for the following generation. What strikes me about the Gambino prosecution, looking at it from this distance, is how much of its success depended on John Gotti himself. The FBI spent years building an evidentiary case. The surveillance was extensive, sophisticated, and professionally executed. But the recordings that destroyed Gotti were recordings of his own words, spoken in a building he chose to use, with a freedom he chose to exercise, in a tone that reflected his absolute certainty that he was beyond reach. He was defeated not only by the government's persistence but by his own belief in his own legend. John Gotti died on June 10, 2002, in the Federal Medical Facility in Springfield, Missouri, from complications of throat cancer. He was 61 years old. He had served 10 years of his life sentence. He received no parole hearing, no compassionate release, no exception of any kind. He died in federal custody as federal law required. What do you think? Was the deal the government made with Gravano justice served, or did 19 murders demand a harsher accounting? That question does not have a clean answer. It lives in the space between what was necessary to close the case and what 19 families lost. Drop your take in the comments. We cut one thread from this story for time. The question of what happened to the Gambino family's political connections in New York after the conviction, and how much of the family's legitimate business infiltration survived the prosecution. Comment Part 2. If that story is worth a full episode. The Gambino case remains, more than 3 decades later, the signature organized crime prosecution in FBI history. It is the case that law enforcement professionals cite when they discuss what a properly resourced, methodically built, long-term investigation can achieve against a target that appears impervious to conventional prosecution. It took years of failed attempts, years of rebuilt effort, a surveillance operation of exceptional technical complexity, and the cooperation of a man with 19 murders on his conscience. None of it was simple. None of it was guaranteed. Every step had a point at which it could have failed. Bruce Moo retired from the FBI after the conviction. He has given interviews over the years describing the case in measured terms, consistently crediting the collective effort of the Gambino squad rather than any single moment of brilliance. The case, he has said, was built one piece at a time over years by agents who understood that patience was the only tool that would work. That framing is accurate and appropriate. It is also incomplete. Because patience alone does not explain the Gotti conviction. What explains it, finally, is that John Gotti could not stop talking. The FBI put a microphone in the right room and waited. And John Gotti, the most celebrated untouchable in the history of American organized crime, did the rest himself. If this case pulled you in, the story of how the FBI dismantled the Lucchese family using nearly identical methods runs parallel to this one in ways that most accounts never connect. That episode is next. If you want more documented FBI investigations told at this depth, subscribe. Every case on this channel is built from public records, court transcripts, and declassified FBI files. No speculation, no embellishment, just the record as it stands.